Thank you. First, I wanted to thank the organizer for making sure that I am awake as the first speaker, that you're all awake and not sleep deprived. So I'll be talking about default options and retirement savings dynamics. So one of the key insights we've learned from behavioral economics is that default options matter. And they matter even when the stakes are really high. So take the decision of how much to contribute to your retirement savings plan. That's one of the most important financial decisions we have to make. If the default option is non-participation, and you have to call your provider to opt in the plan, only half of new hires participate after a year. And this is known as the opt-in regime. Now, if the default option is participation, and you can call your provider to opt out of the plan, more than 90% participate after a year, and this is known as automatic enrollment. So these findings have been tremendously influential. By now, nearly 100 million people around the world are affected by automatic enrollment. This includes all private sector employees in New Zealand, the UK, and Turkey. And in the US, the majority of 401k plans have adopted automatic enrollment. And 5 US states are extending auto-enrollment to all employees who don't have access to a 401k plan through state-run auto-IRAs. So really the hope among policymakers is that automatically enrolling all these people is going to help them reach retirement with more resources and hopefully do some good. But we don't know if that's true. So we have many studies on the short-run effect of automatic enrollment, but none on its long-term impact. And so the question I'm going to ask today is, what is the effect of auto-enrollment on lifetime wealth accumulation and welfare? So the challenge here is that if you want to study the effect of enrolling a 25-year-old on her retirement wealth at 65, you need 40 years of data. And we just don't have 40 years of experience with automatic enrollment. These policies are too recent. And so what I will do to overcome this challenge is first to identify the mechanism through which auto-enrollment affects behavior. And then I'm going to build and estimate a structural life cycle model to predict the long-term effect of this policy. So the contribution is going to be threefold. I will first document a number of new empirical facts about the effect of auto-enrollment. In particular, I will document the effect of auto-enrollment after you switch to a new job. Being auto-enrolled, what happens in your next job. I will also propose a new empirical test to distinguish between alternative explanations of the default effect. And then, motivated by these empirical evidence, I will build and estimate a structural life cycle model. And I'm going to show that the model is going to fit the data really well, and in particular, be able to predict behavior out of sample. Finally, I'm going to use this estimated model to do welfare analysis. And so I will characterize the optimal default option for lifetime welfare, and I'm going to do so under alternative assumptions about social preferences, what should we care about as a society, and about the incidence of this policy. So let me start with some empirics, some facts. I'm going to use two sources of data. Data from US 401k plans. So this is a new proprietary data set that I obtained from a large US pension plan provider. It contains data from nearly 600 firms and 4 million US workers between 2006 and 2017. And in this data set, I can observe monthly 401k contributions, balances, and asset allocations. And I'm going to complement this data set with evidence from a nationally representative panel from the UK. It's a 1% panel of all UK workers. And the nice thing in this UK data is that I can follow workers across job transitions. In the US data, once you leave your employer, I don't know what you're doing. In the UK data, I can follow people across their successive jobs. So here's the third fact I'm going to document.
So just a quick clarification.
Yes.
If that's the only data, you're just going to have to guess at the parameters for preferences and so forth, right?
Yes, I'm going to use quasi-experimental sources of variation in the data to identify parameters. So I don't have evidence and preferences, but I'm going to tell you exactly how each parameter is identified, and I'll have variation in the data that are going to help me identify these in a structural sense. So first fact, auto-enrollment in your current job reduces saving in your next job. So I'm going to take advantage of a mandatory national auto-enrollment policy in the UK that was rolled out between 2012 and 2017. So the largest employer had to auto-enroll all their workers in 2012, and progressively, smaller and smaller employers were subject to the auto-enrollment mandate. And I'm going to compare two workers, new hire 1 and new hire 2. Both of them are going to be hired by the same employer in the same year, so I have year firm fixed effect. One is going to come from a previous employer that was subject to the auto-enrollment mandate, and one is going to come from a previous employer that wasn't subject to auto-enrollment. And I'm going to compare the savings in the new job. So what do we find? If you move to a new job that doesn't have auto-enrollment, being previously auto-enrolled reduces your participation by 10 percentage points, and your contribution rate by half a percentage point. So you've saved more before because you were auto-enrolled, you move to a new job, you end up saving less than people who weren't subject to the policy previously. Now, you may be worried that I'm essentially comparing people moving from a large employer to a small employer versus people who move from a small employer to another small employer. Obviously, these are different. So I control for the size of your previous employer and the size of your current employer every pair, and to test if this is actually the identification assumption is holding, I'm going to run a number of placebo exercises. Let's assume that the policy, instead of the policy rollout starting in 2012, suppose it started in 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, etc. Across all these placebo exercises, you don't find any effect, so we're really capturing something that has to do with the auto-enrollment rollout. Yes?
So we know that they are not like, they cannot like keep contributing to their past
yes.
Program?
No, in the UK you cannot keep contributing and to your past growth. So what this suggests is that the average American is going to change jobs 10 times over her lifetime. And so if you want to study the effect of auto-enrollment on lifetime wealth accumulation, you need some sort of a model to be able to extrapolate these effects over many job transitions. And maybe the short-run evidence we have that hasn't taken into account the effect of job transition may have overstated the long-run effect of these policies. So my second fact is going to tell us something about what type of model we want to write. So now I'm going to move from the UK to the US, and I'm going to compare workers hired before versus after. 86 US employers increase their default contribution rate from a positive number to an even larger positive number. That is, if you're hired in March, you're going to be auto-enrolled at 3%. If you're hired in June, you're going to be auto-enrolled at 6%. So here on the x-axis is the increase in the default contribution rate. So moving from 3 to 4%, 3 to 5, 3 to 6, 3 to 7. And on the y-axis is the change in the participation rate. And so what you see here is that as you increase the default, move from 3 to 4, 3 to 5, 3 to 6, fewer and fewer people participate. The participation rate is going down. Not only that, but more and more people are going to contribute at the lowest contribution rate. That is, if I move from 3 to 6, more people are going to contribute exactly 1 or 2%. So why is this interesting? You nudge people to save more with a higher default, and more of them are going to opt out and stop saving completely or save at the lowest rate. This is indication that this fits a model with opt-out cost. Here's the intuition. Let's say what I really want to do is contribute 1%, and the default is 3%. The default is close enough to what I would have wanted to do by myself, which is 1%. I'm just going to stick with this 3% default. But now if you try to push me too hard, you increase it to 6%. 6% is far enough from my ideal contribution rate, 1%, that now it's worth paying this opt-out cost and going all the way down to 1. Alternative theories, like models of loss aversion or psychological anchoring, make the exact opposite prediction. In these models, if I move the default from 3 to 6, You should see participation going up, because people have a higher reference point now, and savings going up. So this fact tells us, fact 1 tells us we need a model, fact 2 tells us it's probably a model with an opt-out cost. Now the third question is, how large do these opt-out costs need to be? So the third fact is not a new fact. It has been documented for a couple of firms before. I'm going to replicate it in a much larger sample, and I'm going to provide a new interpretation. So I'm going to compare workers hired in the 12 months before versus 12 months after the introduction of auto-enrollment at 3% in 34 US firms. So again, you're hired in March, you're in opt-in regime, the default is 0. You're hired in June, the default is going to be 3%, and you can opt out in the same firms. So these are people hired before the policy. On the x-axis is tenure, so have 3 years of tenure. On the y-axis are cumulative employee contribution, the stock of money that you put in your 401k plan. And this is for the median balance. So you see here, people hired before the policy at the median didn't contribute at all in their first year, so they didn't accumulate anything. People hired after auto-enrollment stick with the default and accumulate 3% of their annual salary in their first year. So people who looked at this evidence said, well, there are pretty large gains from moving from the red line to the blue line. The auto-enrolled are earning a pretty generous tax benefit, as well as a generous employer match. In these companies, employer match at 50% up to a 6% contribution. And so because you have pretty large gains from switching, it must be that whatever friction or opt-out cost is preventing people from switching has to be at least as large as these gains. And so De La Vigna has a back-of-the-envelope calculation which says the opt-out cost should be at least $1,200. Bernheim and al. Estimate a static structural model and find the average switching cost to be $2,200. So you really need that phone call to change your contribution to be worth thousands of dollars to be able to rationalize these patterns in a world without any other behavior bias.
Just a clarification, because we talked about it yesterday, that's assuming intertemporal risk neutrality.
Yes, in a standard model. I mean, these are static models. What they're doing is in a static sense, so there's not even any intertemporal.
No, but my point is, if you have intertemporal risk aversion, that could be a preference at work, not something that's cost as well.
Yes, yes. So this is as a reduced form for, yes, I agree. But I mean, in these models, it's really just almost.
Let's be clear. Reduced form means I've got the structural model right. I'm just doing a reduced form.
Right. I'm
saying you might have the structural model. They have the structural model wrong in the sense that they're assuming that there's zero preference for this. That's all.
Right. No, I agree. I agree. So now let's see what happens over time. The auto-enroll are going to stay at 3% at the median, and so they're going to accumulate 9% over 3 years. People hired before the policy are eventually going to start saving. And when they start saving, they're going to save at contribute at a higher rate and catch up in levels. Which means that now if you did the same back-of-the-envelope calculation, using data from the end of year 3, probably conclude that they earn pretty much the same tax benefit and pretty much the same cumulative employer match benefit. And so if you did the same back-of-the-envelope calculation, you'd say, well, the opt-out cost is probably very small. And this is not a desirable feature. Your estimate of the size of the switching cost is going to depend on the period of observation. And that tells us that we need to go beyond a static model and consider a fully dynamic model. And so what I'll show you today is that in a life cycle model, an opt-out cost of around $250, 10 times smaller than this previous estimate, can generate this type of behavior. Now, are we done? People catch up at the median over 3 years. Why should we expect this policy to have any effect over 40 years? Well, heterogeneity is going to matter a lot. It is true that people catch up at the median over 3 years. It is also true that at the top, policy doesn't seem to have much of an effect. But at the 25th percentile, you see persistent effects over 3 years. Now the question is, are these people just going to take longer to catch up? It's going to take them 20 years to catch up. Or are these effects going to persist all the way to retirement? To answer this question, I'm going to build a life cycle model. So the model is going to have three key features that were absent from the previous literature, are going to help explain what we observe in the data. First, dynamics, the fact that people can catch up by contributing more in the future. So if I don't save a lot today, I can make up for it by contributing a little bit more later on. Liquidity considerations. There's a tax penalty for contributing to a 401k plan because if you want to withdraw your money early, you have to pay a tax penalty. That's going to make this retirement account less liquid than other assets. Finally, we have uncertainty. People are going to be uncertain about their income, about their employment status, and in a world where there's both uncertainty, dynamics, and liquidity consideration, you'll have an option value of waiting. For a lot of people, early in their tenure, there's a lot of uncertainty, you have this liquidity consideration, you may choose to wait for a little bit before exercising your option value and making a contribution change.
Just clarification question, like the previous graph, it's accumulated contribution or it's accumulated contribution plus return?
No, see, only contribution. So cumulative contribution, because I wanted to, I didn't want the figure to be, it's harder to interpret returns because they're stochastic, and so it's just cumulative contributions.
But in the context of a life cycle model, you have a targeted wealth, right? So that's what you should target. You should catch up in terms of wealth, not in terms of accumulated contributions. That's meaningless. Right,
but a lot of the benefits you get, so this 50% employer match, is in terms of contributions, not in terms of wealth. And so if you think of the benefits you're getting from contributing, for the tax benefit and match the benefit, they're really in terms of contribution. Then I've done the wealth thing. It's not that different because these people are hired 12 months apart. It's just easier to interpret and less noisy when you look at cumulative contributions. Okay, and so what you need in this type of model is a mechanism for generating these default effects. So I'm going to assume that agents are going to bear utility cost K to choose a contribution rate that's different from the default. That is, if the default is 3% and I want to contribute 5%, I need to pay this cost K. Now, my new default is going to become 5%, and in 6 months, if I want to move from 5 to 6, I'm going to pay again this cost K. Okay, so the default is going to be endogenous. It's going to be equal to my previous contribution rate. What do these utility costs capture? Probably a lot of things. Real costs, it takes time to call the provider, seek help from a financial advisor. But they probably also capture a number of behavioral costs. So attention costs, the cost to optimize or make a financial plan, certain forms of present bias. And I'm going to make a very extreme assumption, which is that these cost K is the same for everyone and in every period. And I'm going to try to see, under this very restrictive assumption, how much of the variation we observe in the data can be captured by this very parsimonious specification of preferences.
Is that what people typically have in mind when they speak about benchmark and you know, these behavioral biases whereby people don't want to deviate from their target? Because I would have thought that, especially for those bottom 25%, what people keep in mind is not the new benchmark that is being exogenously imposed on them, and that they adjust within one period, I think, according to your model, but rather the previous amount of savings that they had. And therefore, it takes time for them to actually accept having to contribute 5% when they were contributing 1%.
So let me maybe delay the question. So you're saying, so in the model, people are going to, wealth is going to be part of your decision problem. You're going to take into account wealth and how much wealth you have. This is just in terms of, if you do nothing, what portion of your salary is going to be put in the 401k plan?
No, he's saying it's completely arbitrary what you're calling a reference point. Reference points are, you know, it's whatever you want to call a reference point. There's no theory of where the reference point is.
Okay, so here it's exogenously given. Your employer is going to automatically enroll you at some number. If you do nothing, what I mean by the default is if you do nothing, that's what you're going to contribute. If you want to contribute something different, you need to take your phone or log in the website and change it. Now, if you have other, as I showed earlier, other theories of reference point, like loss aversion, make predictions that are rejected in the data. So that's why I'm going with this version. But let's maybe come back to this during the discussion. Okay, let me give you a quick preview of the different component of the model. People are going to have access to different assets, both a realistic retirement account, has both matching contributions, a vesting schedule, but they can also save in the form of liquid savings and borrow through high interest unsecured debt. Think of credit cards. People are going to, the model features a realistic labor market with both unemployment, job-to-job transitions, income risk, that's going to vary both with your age and your tenure. So if you're young and early in your tenure, you're more likely to lose your job or transition from job to job than if you're middle-aged and you've been in your job for several years. The model is going to feature a government sector, going to provide progressive tax and benefit, feature progressive tax and benefit system, in particular social security that's modeled after the rules of the social security system, and unemployment insurance. And you're going to have a tax benefit for contributing to a retirement account. You don't pay taxes on capital gains, it's tax deferred, and you have this tax penalty for early withdrawal if you're younger than 59.5. Finally, the model is going to feature mortality risk and changing household composition over the life cycle. So if you're young and childless, you don't value consumption as much as if you're 40 and you have 3 kids. Okay, so the model has 8 state variables. Let me maybe very, very quick here. What's really new is that the default contribution rate is going to be a state variable. Because when I change my contribution rate, I take into account the fact that tomorrow my new default is going to be whatever I choose to contribute today. And then people are going to choose, have 2 choices, how much to save or borrow in terms of liquid assets, and how much to contribute to the retirement account. So if when you're employed, you can contribute positive amounts to your retirement account. And when you're either unemployed or retired, you have negative contributions, you're taking money out of the retirement account. How am I going to estimate and identify this model? I'm going to take data from 34 plans who have a 50% match up to 6% and no auto-escalation feature. I'm going to have 2 groups of workers. People in the opt-in group that are hired in the year before auto-enrollment, and people in the auto-enrollment group that are hired in the year after the introduction of this policy with a default at 3%. As you can see here, if you're hired 1 month after the policy, you have an 80% chance of contributing exactly 3%. If you're hired 1 month before the policy, you have almost a 0 probability of contributing exactly 3%. How am I going to use this quasi-natural source of variation to identify the model parameters? Well, I have 3 preference parameters, an elasticity of intertemporal substitution, an intertemporal discount factor, and this opt-out cost. So there's a difficulty for separately identifying the AIS and the intertemporal discount factor because both of them affect how much you want to save. Now, one nice feature of my setting is that employer match contributions up to 6%, which means that there is a kink in the interest rates you're facing. You get a 50% return up to 6, 0 if you contribute 7, and so bunching at 6% is going to tell us something about how sensitive people are to changes in the interest rate, and that's going to tell us something about the EIS, while the overall level of saving is going to tell us something about the discount factor. Finally, bunching at the default is going to tell us something about the size of the opt-out cost. That is, if the opt-out cost is 0, you should see no bunching at 3%. There's nothing special about it. If the opt-out cost is infinitely large, everyone should be at 3% and never move away from 3%.
So we don't need any risk preferences here?
No, so it's CEAR-IRE, so the elasticity of intertemporal substitution is going to be the inverse of the...
Because you've assumed a
yes.
additive intertemporal, yes, okay, yes. So you have assumed 2 parameters here, that's all.
Yes, no, yeah, that's a fair assessment.
If I have a separate saving account, then this kink at 6% doesn't identify anything, right? And when I increase my contribution up to 6% on that account, and reduce my saving on the other account, that's just an arbitrage.
So if you think that you have another account that gives you a 50% instantaneous rate of return, then that could, I mean, as long as you think that there's no other asset that gives you a return that's as generous as the 401k plan, but I don't have any data on people's outside savings. I'm going to have some prediction about it, compare it to what's out there in the literature. But yeah, I don't have data on that, and it's going to be featured in the model. So if that's your concern, in the model, when I'm going to then generate benching, it's going to be taken into account people's outside savings, but I don't have data on that. Okay, so I'm going to estimate the model using a simulated method of moment. My estimates for time preferences are going to be extremely standard. An AIS of 1/2 and a discount factor of the quarterly level 0.98 at an annual frequency it would be 0.96. It's extremely standard. And what's new here is that this opt-out cost estimate is $250, 10 times smaller than previous estimates. Let's look at what moments I've used for estimation and how does the model do at matching these moments with only these 3 preference parameters, only these 3 degrees of freedom. So here are the distribution of contribution rates before and after the policy. This is the data. Before the policy, end of first year, a lot of people didn't participate. Right after the policy, you see a lot of benching at 3%. The model does a pretty good job at capturing these patterns of contribution rates. Benching at 3%, you see benching at the employer match threshold. The model tends to overestimate it for the opt-in group. What about the dynamics? So you see that in the opt-in group, participation slowly increases over time, while in the auto-enrollment group, it stays very high. But people slowly opt out of the default. So in the first quarter, 80% of workers are exactly at 3%. By the end of 4 years, only 30% are exactly at 3%. And the model, again, in red, is going to do a really good job at capturing the dynamics of contributions and participation for these 2 groups. Now, the model doesn't target heterogeneity, but we can try to look at what the model predicts there. Let me skip this one. So this is what I showed you in the beginning, the fact that at the 25th percentile, you seem to have persistent effect over 3 years, catch up at the median, and no real effect at the top. And so the model here seems to replicate this.
So that's because you have the same dollar amount for everyone, right? So in proportion.
Yes. So that's going. I'm going to get back to this. It's going to be critical.
It's more expensive for poor people.
I'm going to talk about this right now. So your point is exactly right, and so now we can think of how my data is not very rich in terms of observables. I only see people's income and people's age, but I can see along these dimensions what does the model predict compared to the data. So I'm going to run a regression. I'm going to interact the treatment effect with both age dummies and income dummies. So in the data, you see that younger people are a lot more likely to stick with the default option than older people. If you run the same regression in the model, you get very similar coefficients. And the intuition there is that if you're 20 and you have 50 years to undo the effect of the default, you have a very high option value of weighting, and so you're going to stick with the default. If you're 65 and you're going to retire next month, if you don't get your match now, there's no getting it back later by contributing more, so you have much stronger incentive to act. How about income? Low-income people are more likely to stick with the default option than high-income people. The model is going to generate this through 2 mechanisms. So what you mentioned, which is that $250 is going to matter more if you're low income than if you're high income, and a version of the model which the proportional cost doesn't fit this evidence. But also, a lot of social programs are progressive. The tax, if you're high income, you're facing a higher marginal tax rate, so the benefit from contributing is much larger. And if you're high income, Social Security is not going to replace a big part of your income, so you really need to save in your 401k plan, while both the tax incentive and Social Security incentives are much weaker for low-income people. Now, we can, doing with time, can think of, let me maybe skip. No, let me not skip.
It's listed here.
Okay, so I have 10 minutes. Yeah, I think I'm still fine. Okay, now let's unpack a bit this question of why is my estimate of the switching cost so much smaller than previous estimates? The first hypothesis is that Well, maybe it's because I have more data. I'm using 4 years of data instead of 1 year of data, and maybe that's it. Well, I'm going to fix time preferences and re-estimate the opt-out cost using only the first year of data. And really, that doesn't change much. So it's not that I have more data than previous papers. Is it because I have uncertainty? So if I remove uncertainty in the model, income becomes deterministic, well, it does increase the opt-out cost to $300. So that seems to be part of it. Maybe it's because I have this liquidity consideration. So if I remove all penalties for early withdrawals, so no tax penalty, well, actually you get much larger. You need a much larger opt-out cost. Because in this world, there are no penalty for withdrawals, and I'm getting this generous match. I need a very high opt-out cost to stop me from taking advantage from this match. Dynamics are going to be extremely important. So if I assume that you can only change your contribution rate in the first period, and then you have to stick with it throughout your tenure, I would need a $750 switching cost to rationalize the observed behavior. Because now you lose this option value of waiting. If you don't act, you've lost the option to catch up later on. And finally, if you make this a pure arbitrage opportunity, that is, soon as you put money in the retirement account, you get the match and you can right away put it in the liquid account, no penalty, just pure arbitrage, which is what the De La Vigna back of the envelope calculation assumed, I would need a $1,200 switching cost. So that really tells you, yes.
So when you say no tax penalty, you still have to pay income tax on it, just not the extra penalty. Okay.
Yes, yes.
Yep, thanks.
Okay, so now, the next question, yeah, fine. I'm going to use this model estimated out of 4 years of data to make predictions over 40 years. Why should you believe anything I'm going to tell you next? And I'm going to try to convince you that the advantage of structural estimation is the ability to extrapolate to other policies, other population, and also other time periods. So obviously I cannot predict the future, so I cannot test that, but I can check how the model performs in for other policies and for other populations or institutional settings. The first out of sample validation exercise I'm going to run is to take this model estimated out of the introduction of auto-enrollment at 3% and see how it predicts what happened when you increase the default from 3 to 5 or from 2 to 6. I have 11 cases, and over these 11 cases the model performs remarkably well. In 85% of the cases, I cannot reject at the 10% level that the model prediction and the data are identical. For the sake of time, I'll be quick. Next, I'm going to do something even more ambitious. I'm going to take this model, estimated in the US. I'm going to recalibrate the model to capture the UK retirement system, tax system, income process, and try to see whether this model, these preference parameters estimated in the US, can predict the response of UK workers to the introduction of their national auto-enrollment policy. So this is what you see in the data. Before the policy, after the policy, the default was at 1%, so you see some benching at 1%. The model does really well out of sample at predicting the distribution of contribution rate before and after the policy. Can also think of what happened for people for these job switchers. Remember, in the data, participation dropped by 11 percentage points when you move from auto-enrollment to non-auto-enrollment. No real effect when you moved from auto-enrollment to auto-enrollment. Again, the model performed quite well at predicting out of sample what happened when people switch jobs. So hopefully now that I've built some confidence in the predictive power of the model, we can use it to think about these long-term effects. So I'm going to simulate in the model a typical auto-enrollment policy at 3% adopted by every employer in the economy over a lifetime. Okay, and so here on the x-axis are deciles of lifetime earnings. So these are the poorest people, these are the highest earning people in terms of their lifetime earnings. And on the y-axis is the change in wealth at 65 relative to an opt-in regime. So I'm going to simulate the exact same people in a world where there's no auto-enrollment and in a world where every employer in the economy has auto-enrollment at 3%. And I'm going to look at them at 65 and compare their wealth. So what you see here, it's hard to see, is that for most people, you see almost no change in wealth at 65. At the median or above the median, this policy doesn't really seem to do much because people eventually catch up. However, at the bottom, for the bottom 2 deciles of lifetime earnings, you see pretty large effect. You can increase wealth at 65 for the bottom decile of lifetime earning by 12 percentage points.
Excuse me, one question. So the wealth in your 401k plan has to be taxed?
Yes.
Before you take it out, or when you take it out. So is this wealth after tax or wealth pre-tax?
This is a great point. This is wealth pre-tax. In the model, you have to pay
really,
the tax,
yeah.
so it's even lower than I agree. Yes, that's a good point. We can see a bit how does this look over the life cycle. So if you look at people at the bottom quintile, what you see here is that the effects are very large, but you start seeing catch up over 20 years. So even if we had 20 years of data, we would overestimate the effect of this policy at the bottom, just take them a lot longer to start to catch up. At the median, you see pretty small effects, and at the top, you see pretty small effects. Now, you could be interested on what happens in terms of liquid assets. You push people to save more in the retirement account, maybe they just borrow more on their credit card or reduce the liquid saving. What you see here is that it's very little happening there. And the intuition there is that these 2 assets serve different purposes. The retirement account is for life cycle smoothing. The liquid asset is really to protect you against shocks, and so you don't see a lot of intratemporal crowd-out, which is consistent with what you observe in the data, both from Chetty and Leibson and all. And really what seems to matter is this intertemporal crowd-out. Push me to save more today, I'm going to save less later on, rather than you push me to save more today, I'm going to borrow a lot on my credit card.
And a precautionary motive when we have a CEAR-IRE function, so we don't have any prudence at all. Gee whiz.
Yes.
Is it just hand waving that says that's probably why it's happening, or because that's not what in the structural model says?
I have to cover welfare, and I'll keep this question. No, I mean, the rationale here is that I wanted to show that a model is as standard as it gets. Take the textbook life cycle model. With a pretty small friction, you're able to generate a lot of what you observe in the data. And so that's why I made these choices of going CEAR-IRE, being extremely standard in terms of the preference classification. But let's get back to this. Now, I have 3 minutes to talk about welfare. I'm going to look at the problem from the perspective of a policymaker who tries to maximize welfare and picks a default that's going to be adopted by all employers over a lifetime. There are going to be 2 questions. How should we think about the preferences of these social planner? And how should we think about the incidence? And the reason is a question about the incidence is that if more people participate in the plan, employers have to spend more money matching. There's a question, where does this come from? How are you going to pay for this policy? So in terms of social preferences, I'm going to allow the social planner to discount the future at a different rate. Maybe the social planner thinks people have too impatient and chooses a higher discount factor. Maybe the social planner has strong inequality aversion, and so it's going to put a lot more weight on low-income people, or maybe less. And maybe the social planner thinks that these opt-out costs are a real cost that we should care about, that are welfare relevant, or that these opt-out costs are really just a mistake that should have received no weight in our welfare calculation. In terms of incidence, I'm going to allow employers to respond to the policy either by reducing their profit. So if you have more, your matching costs go up, you just reduce your profit. Or by reducing wages. So if more people participate, matching costs go up, wages go down to compensate for it and keep budget balanced. Or by making the retirement plan less generous, by reducing the generosity of the matching rate. Okay, so what are the results? If the policymaker is utilitarian, has the same preferences as the individuals, this policy doesn't improve welfare. The intuition is that if you're utilitarian, people are already saving more than what's implied by their preferences because they have these tax incentives and match incentives. And so any policy that's going to push them to save even more early on is going to reduce welfare. But even in this case, people at the very bottom benefit from the policy. Because before the policy, they didn't participate at all. They didn't get any matching benefits. Now they participate. And so if you put a lot of weight on these people, even if you're utilitarian, but you're very inequality averse, you're going to choose a default around 5 or 6%. And finally, if you think the reason we have Social Security and the reason we have this tax benefit is that governments are paternalistic and think that people are not saving enough. So if you have a higher discount factor, then you want to put the default at around the employer match threshold, which is 6%. Let me briefly conclude. I have 20 seconds. What have we learned? What have we learned about the life cycle hypothesis, and what have we learned about nudges? So this auto-enrollment effect has been seen as a major challenge for the life cycle hypothesis. How could it be that people think dynamically, think about their life cycle, if something as insignificant as a default could dramatically change their saving outcome? What I've showed you today is that with a small friction, the life cycle hypothesis is consistent with auto-enrollment effect. And provide quite a lot of insight about the heterogeneity of observed behavior. What have we learned about nudges? Well, in a dynamic setting, saving nudges are less effective. And the intuition is simple. If saving nudges work and people accumulate more wealth, well, that reduces their incentive to save more later on. If they're doing what they're doing and people end up after a few years having more wealth, well, that in any model you can write, or most model you can write, this is going to reduce their incentive to save later on. And so dynamically, they're going to be less effective than what you observe in the short run. And I think this insight is going to extend to a setting where you have both uncertainty about the future, so an option value of waiting, and where people can take corrective actions later on, can undo the effect of the nudge by taking actions, corrective actions. Thank you.
So thank you for inviting me. This is a really important paper. This is Taha's job market paper. He got a job at MIT. I have nothing left to say. This clearly has made serious contributions, empirical, theoretical, policy, and it goes against that, which is in and of itself a contribution. I'm going to briefly say what he said, but then I'm going to get to. I have very few minor points. This is such a great paper, but just to repeat what he said, I think maybe a little bit different nuances that he pushed. Just the policy, US, UK, New Zealand. I think in his speech, in his talk, he said there's 100 million people who opt in. There's 100 million people who accept the default, which is a massive number. And the puzzle is, in my mind, why are these 100 million people accepting the default option, and how does it fit in with his life cycle model? So that's essentially where I'm going to be going. He didn't talk about it in the talk, but in the paper he goes through in some detail the behavioral cognitive reasons why we use auto enrollment, and what of these reasons are about cognitive cost, thinking. It's hard, it's difficult to think. This is a difficult problem. Therefore, if somebody gives me a nice thing where I can tick the box, I will happily accept that, tick the box and stop thinking and solve my problem that way. So in my thoughts about this paper, I think I would like to think a bit more about these cognitive costs. And the cognitive costs apply for these 100 million people who we know accept the auto-enrollment. But my question is, what about these cognitive costs in the life cycle context? Because in the life cycle context, you know, you're optimizing over your whole life, and it's a really complicated problem. So I suppose my major comment on this paper, query, it's not even a comment, is can we think about in more detail these cognitive costs, which are important to explain day one, when you enroll, when you opt in the context of a life cycle model, which is very highly rational, very complicated, with massive cognitive costs. So that, I think, is sort of my main thought about this paper. Yeah, Taha says this is wrong, and the key find, I think the empirical stuff at the beginning of the paper that he went through quite fast, where he documented the you enroll, and then individuals act to offset that. That's sort of the key. So you enroll, your saving is up, and then your savings come down again. So I think what I'm trying to, in my few minutes, trying to understand the enrolling, savings going up, and then going down again. How do we fit that into what I think is an important story, which is this notion of cognitive costs? The thinking involved in going up and the thinking involved in coming down. Just to repeat, I'm not going to, he did this great. Again, policy, I'll come back to. Okay, so here I suppose is my main argument. My question is, if you're thinking in a world of cognitive costs, okay, and you want to reduce or keep or lower your cognitive costs, not only in the first time period, time one, okay, when these 100 million people opt in, but if you want to reduce your or keep your cognitive costs low across the whole of your life cycle, okay, if you are living in a life cycle world where you're thinking into the future, I'm not sure, I don't really understand, maybe it's just my naivety, and I don't typically do this kind of model, so maybe you can help me, but I'm not sure I understand if this mechanism that he's talking about serves to keep your cognitive costs low, both at time zero, time one, when you're opting, and for the next many years. Yeah, this is a meme, but it's sort of going what I'm trying to get at. Thinking is hard, okay? So we want to reduce thinking, and does his story explain reducing thinking not only in time period, but period one, but into the future? So he's saying basically that this is the life cycle model that you have to optimize. This is incredibly costly. Okay, in a world where cognitive costs matter, is this the appropriate setting in which to think about these issues? So what I was trying to think about, and again, I don't play in this kind of world. I'm not a structural guy, but when I think of these kind of structural models, we often think about consumption smoothing, keeping consumption flat over many periods. That's a nice goal that people want. Can we think of a world, and maybe this could be modeled as well, where we have cognitive cost smoothing, where we try and keep our, we have to think about stuff, but we want to minimize across all of the different periods, and I'm not sure we have that in the current model. So I'm asking the question, can we think of a way of minimizing cognitive costs over the whole of the life cycle? Okay, so that's sort of my main thought as a non-structural guy in how to interpret this model. I have sort of one more point, which is about empirical evidence. The data that he has is amazing. Rich, so much stuff. He talked about it really well. One of his motivations was when he said there's no long-term studies of auto-enrollment, which is correct. Most of the current literature looks at very short-term. So what he proposes then is this life cycle model, 40 years into the future until the day you retire, okay? Which is great in and of itself. I'm suggesting maybe there's a middle ground as well, which is also interesting. The 3-year, 5-year, 6-year story, which he can do with his data. He has data, where is it? He's from 2006 to 2000, he's got 12 years of data, okay? I'm interested as a reader to see, so going back, what is his starting story? His starting story is you enroll, your savings go up, and then in the next 2, 3, 4 years, it comes down again. Okay, that's very interesting. And he can address that with the current data that he has, using really standard, simplistic, the stuff I do, diff and diffs. Okay, you have a great event window, so you have a great exogenous shock, you can have long-ish event windows, and you can tell stories using much more, I would call it medium-term kind of evidence. Not the 40-year stuff, not the very short-term stuff, which can help in pushing the kind of story that you're telling, which is, for me, the big takeaway, the default saving goes up, and then over time you come down again. Why? Who's doing it? What's going on? And so, essentially, this is the data, and so I'm saying to him, exploit this data more. It's fantastic. And I'm interested to think, okay, so, my last few slides. What happens, why do these, who are the people, who are the 100 million people who opted, who accept the default? What do we know about them? Is it their very first job? Because he documented really nicely that this changes when you change job, which is really cool. But what do we know about these 100 million who opt in the first place? Are they young? Is it their first job? Is it their later jobs? compare across age, compare across time to retirement. All of these things he can play with and give us more information in the medium-term stuff, not the full life cycle model, which would be very interesting. Heterogeneity, all kinds of other stuff he can play with that I would be interested to accent to help persuade us of his main story. So, my last slide, second last slide, this stuff is really, really important. This paper is going to be read for many, many years. It's going to be published really well. And then, as his last slide, there's very strong motivation for many more studies like this. The whole nudge literature can use this kind of analysis. And I'm going to end on that. Thank
you. Yeah, thanks a lot for this great discussion. Maybe two quick points. On this question of cognitive cost, I completely agree with you. I don't think this is the right setting to truly identify what exactly what exactly these cognitive costs are. But at least it gives us some insight. If you think that these costs are $2,000, things like planning or thinking cannot be worth $2,000, and so that's probably not where you want to look. But if you think it's in around $200, $250, that's more plausible. And more of an anecdote here, the average cost of a consultation with a financial advisor is $250. So it seems that the market is pricing this right. On this question of middle ground, I agree with you. I could look at longer time span. The issue there is that there's a lot of attrition. In the UK, once you leave the firm, and so after 3 or 4 years, lose roughly half of my sample. And so if you look at 6 years, the people who survive those 6 years are going to be this very selected sample. And that's why the evidence on job-to-job switchers is really important. Because once you bring both things, both the people who stay and the people who switch, you have a fuller picture of what's happening. But thanks a lot for the discussion.
I actually do structural modeling. I'm very concerned that this is methodologically almost identical to the work that Ben Handel has done in AER 2013, Handel-Kolstad for health insurance. The way you do your stylized facts, the two stylized facts are exactly the same sort of structural model, exactly the same sort of talk about social welfare. I think you probably would want to reference that, just a thought. But secondarily, my real concern here is that, and I actually want to disagree completely with Barry, I think the whole point of doing a structural model is so that you can do a welfare calculation. You don't do, I can change this observable here or that observable here. You can analyze what is the welfare cost of this inertia, let's use Ben Handel's term for it, which is exactly the same term. Then you've simply got to get the economics straight. If you assume that it's a cost at the outset, yes, it's parsimonious, yes, it's the way the literature does it. Well, if you assume away the stuff that makes it not a cost, which is, I have a preference for doing the same thing over time, that's called intertemporal risk aversion. It's a non-additive intertemporal utility function. There's nothing in standard theory that assumes that it has to be additive. It's a bit like saying production theory is wrong because technology is not Cobb-Douglas. Well, Jesus, we can relax that a little bit. So it turns out in Ben's work, and I think in this work as well, there is a simple preference explanation for this. Now, I'm not saying 100% of this is due to preference. That's not my point. My point is, if you build a model that says 100% of it, and I know your social planner had a fraction at the end, but that's just arbitrary choosing a parameter off the top of your head. But if you build a model in where 100% of it is a cost, then gee whiz, you're going to have to show a welfare cost. So I think there's some very serious thinking about the type of model you build that either assumes a welfare cost or shows a welfare cost. That was why at the very beginning I asked the question, gee, where are you going to get reference parameters from? And the answer is by closing down the model so tightly, like as a fish's arsehole at 60 fathoms, you don't leave any room for a risk aversion parameter to do anything. So I think we need to be very careful here. I understand the structure. Hallelujah, I'm getting a job at MIT, that's great. But we've got to be very careful about, we've got to be very careful about building structural models that hide the preference parameters that allow us to tell the other story. And that's all my concern is.
Right, no, I mean, here's one maybe quickly. On the Ben Handel stuff, I know some of his work, but I think here what I'm trying to highlight is the dynamic aspect, where I feel a lot of his work in health insurance is not about these dynamics, except the fact that you can undo things later on, but maybe I'm not referring to the same paper.
It is.
Okay, maybe not his But I should definitely look at that. On this question, yes, I'm assuming additive time preferences. You agree I'm a bit hand-waving about what this cost is. So first, why am I going with the cost rather than some other specification? I think it's because the data seems to indicate that when you see it moving from 3 to 6, more people are going to opt out. Seems to indicate that an opt-out cost is the right way to...
No, you're just hand-waving. You're just saying the first model I came up with can explain the data. I'll give you that.
Right,
but there are 55 other models that can explain the data.
I mean, I agree. Yeah, I could. In terms of the model that we're discussing the literature for this, so things like loss aversion, anchoring, this seems to be the one that's more consistent with the data. I agree with you that I'm also making other assumptions like time separable utility, and I completely agree that it's not something I test. And it'd be interesting to see how robust the results are to other assumptions there. And I could do more robustness on. One interesting result on welfare is that whether you take these costs to be welfare relevant or not, doesn't change the ultimate policy. And so maybe whether you assume it's time separable or not is maybe going to change it or not, and I'm pretty open to testing that.
So in the US, as you know, it's optional for employers to offer a pension. It's up to the employer to decide. And the structure within some parameters is also optional. So about half of the workers have no pension. And the concern I have is with the external validity of this model. So how do you know that the firms and the workers are at all representative for the half of the workforce that has no pension? Because that's where the states have been going, is to mandate that employers offer something for workers with no plan. So that's one thing. The other thing is the match is typically a function of the employee population. So the reason that employers usually give matches is not out of the goodness of their heart, but because under ERISA regulations, they want to meet non-discrimination rules. So you have to have the low-income people contributing enough relative to the high-income people, and these non-discrimination tests cost firms a lot of money every year to make sure that they meet them. So I guess what I'm saying is that the structure of the match and the structure of the default is probably a function of the workforce. And so it's not really exogenous in the sense that you have to assume when you do what you do. So that's my
right. So on the first part, I completely agree with you, and I don't think that these results would speak directly to what's happening with state-run auto-IRAs, where you're targeting a different population. When I calibrate the model, like estimate the model income process, I look at people in the source of income and programs and participation that have access to a 401k plan. So it's really, I think I should have made this clearer. I'm really looking at this population, people who have access to a 401k plan. If you want to extrapolate to this other population, you need to make different assumptions about their income, and I completely agree. In terms of what's happening in terms of the match, I think what the identifying assumption here is that I'm comparing people before and after, and they're facing the same match. In this population, I'm looking at the most common matches. I agree that if you, so it doesn't bias my estimate of the opt-out cost, because both of these groups, before and after, face the same match. But you may be worried that if they're selected on some unobservable working in that company, then for external validity, rather than simply identification, yeah, that could be an issue.
Just a short follow-up. So do you have in your sample any plans that increased or decreased the match? And how do you perform there with that experiment?
So I didn't use that that's a good point. I could look at employers, who increased or decreased. There's some worry about heterogeneity there, where maybe it's a signal about the financial health of the firm, but I could look at that dimension.
I was wondering about auto-escalation. It seems that given people's average income dynamics, that would be really good in a model like this. And have you thought about using your model to think about what the optimal auto-escalation would be? States could use that kind of idea if they're going to try to encourage people to create a pattern. Have you looked at that?
Yes, it's not in the paper. I did some early work with that. There are some interesting implications for, do you want to do auto-escalation that is time-dependent or state-dependent? So the original Taha proposal was every time you get a pay raise, your contribution rate is going to increase. That seems to have more positive welfare effects than what's actually implemented in terms of auto-escalation, that every calendar year you get an increase. So it's not in the paper. I think the paper has a lot of things going on, and I may do something on that later on. I just played a bit in the model what happens, but yeah.
So I wanted to follow up on Olivia's idea about the optionality here. So it seems like an interesting feature is that the default savings rate for firm 1 crowds out the saving when you move to firm 2, right? So that's a key feature. So what that means is that the savings effect of increasing your default is higher when others have a high default than when they don't. In other words, everyone moving together will work better than individual firms moving separately, right? So it seems like you're in a really great position to compare all firms do 3% versus firms do all different things and the mean is 3. And then similarly talking about how a social planner who coordinates all the firms would work differently than firms working, separately. And I'd be interested to know if you thought.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. It's not in the paper. I played a bit with that, trying to see varying the adoption rate, and it seems that your intuition is absolutely right. You really need a critical mass. Once you reach 90%, that's where you get the biggest return, and you don't. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I could maybe include it in the paper, but yeah.
So you look at unsecuritized debt, but thinking about securitized debt, there's a new paper by Skimmyhorn and Bill Skimmyhorn and some colleague, the usual suspects who do this kind of stuff. And they actually find that there's an increase in auto loans and mortgage balances on quite large amounts when you auto enroll. So thinking about how that debt changes could change your entire wealth, right? So why isn't that in the...
No, that's a good point. And so they have two results. First, they find that there's very little happening on the credit cards, and they see that. First, I don't have data on that, and it's harder to interpret because an increase in mortgage debt could mean that you're actually accumulating more assets or buying a durable good. It's not clear whether it's
pretty quickly, right? So if you're spending more on
right
in the short run, especially if you're that lower percentile of income, it seems like you could do some simulations with different.
So you need to make quite a lot of assumptions about whether you think getting a mortgage increases your wealth or decreases your wealth, whether buying a car, what's the depreciation.
Yeah.
And so for this paper, given that I don't have data on that, and it would imply identifying the number of parameters that I don't know how to identify, I just, but it's an, I mean, I agree with you that it's potentially important.
Thank you very much.